Hi, adoptive families and adoption agency staff. This education is presented by Adoption Training Program and is entitled International Adoption Nutrition, an interview with Mishelle Rudzinski. Mishelle is a clinically certified pediatric speech-language pathologist specializing in the communication and feeding of children with severe disabilities. Mishelle adopted her daughter at age 5 from Kazakhstan. She became passionate about the need for improved orphan nutrition after witnessing her daughter's dramatic recovery from debilitating rickets within weeks of receiving vitamin supplements. Mishelle Rudzinski and Cindy Kaplan co-founded Spoon Foundation in 2007. Cindy also had adopted a child internationally that had remarkable gains in health from a carefully improved diet. The mission of Spoon Foundation is to improve the nutrition of orphaned, fostered, and adopted children so they can grow and thrive. Their goals are to give as many orphans as possible the chance for a healthy development, to improve nutrition policies and procedures for orphans around the world, and to ensure that adopted children get the nutrition they need once they come home. I first want to give you a big thank you for helping us with this educational project. I know that you have a very busy schedule and that we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to get right to my first question. My first question is, it seems like in the past couple of years, adoption and medical professionals are paying more and more attention to nutrition and development. Why do you think that is?
Well, in 2006, when Cindy Kaplan and I each adopted our children, we were shocked at the degree of malnutrition our children had, despite the good care that we knew they'd received in their respective baby homes. And we were so moved by their conditions that we wanted to help in some way. So we started reaching out to international NGOs to find an organization that addressed nutrition of children living in orphanages, and we couldn't find anybody that addressed that. So that's basically why we started Spoon Foundation, with the mission to improve the nutrition of children living without families. And we engaged a lot of influential professionals and organizations in our medical advisory board and through our partnerships, people like Dr. Dana Johnson, Dr. Julian Davies, partners like Joint Council and Holt. And with that engagement, the word started getting out about the importance of nutrition for this population. And then about a couple years after we started Spoon, we completed the first ever study of the nutrition of children living in institutions. And those findings highlighted the extent of malnutrition in this population. So prior to the study, many people believed that the nutrition of children in institutions in developing countries would probably be better than their peers living in families, because at least kids in institutions usually had 3 meals a day, their menu was overseen by the government, but that turned out not to be the case at all. It turned out that kids in institutions had much higher rates of anemia, vitamin D deficiency, stunting, wasting, being underweight, all those things that indicate malnutrition. And so because the state of their nutrition was highlighted, I think more and more people are becoming aware of the high risk that kids in institutions have for malnutrition.
Do you think that is due to nutrition or feeding behaviors or both?
We're believing, although this isn't completely studied yet, we're believing it's a combination of poor nutrition and poor nurturing. Mm-hmm. And there was a study done in China where the nutritional status of kids was measured, and kids who were getting a lot of nurture, and it was compared to kids who were not. And surprisingly enough, the kids getting a lot of nurture didn't grow as much as would have been expected. And what was missing from that study was the kids were not getting improved nutrition. So what we're starting to see and believe is that kids in institutions are not growing as well and have a larger percentage of micronutrient deficiencies because, one, they're not getting the love and attention and nurture they need, and two, they're not getting the good diet that they need. They may be getting enough food, although often not. It's surprising when you think they're getting enough and then you measure it, they're not. But even if they are getting enough food, it's probably not the right kinds of food.
Okay, so why are internationally adopted children at risk for malnutrition?
Many, many reasons. And it starts even prenatally. So it might be that their birth mother had inadequate prenatal care, a poor prenatal diet, Many kids who live in institutions may have had low birth weight, they might have been premature, and then, as we all know, kids in institutions are not breastfed. They're sometimes given formula, but not even always formula. Sometimes they're started out on animal milk right away, whether it's cow's milk, buffalo milk in some countries, mare's milk in some countries, and that kind of milk does not have the nutrients that babies need. And then even when they get formula, sometimes the formula isn't fortified the way that formula in the U.S. would be, or oftentimes it's watered down and diluted to stretch it out more, and then they're not getting the nutrients they need. A lot of institutions introduce solid foods too early to kids. They, for whatever reason, it might be a cultural reason, it might be to save money, it might be they don't have enough formula, and so kids are getting solid foods too early, and that means they're not getting the nutrients that they're supposed to be getting from the formula. And then it might just be what we would commonly think, that the orphanages don't have the amount, the necessary food, so kids aren't getting enough, or the food they're getting doesn't have the nutrients that they need. And then there's feeding practices. I mean, there are just so many reasons, but what we've seen universally in the orphanages that we've gone to are inappropriate feeding practices that lead to malnutrition. One that a lot of people are familiar with is bottle propping. Bottles are often propped, and you can imagine what that means. The bottle might fall on the floor, and then the baby misses a meal. It might drop out of their mouth, and then they don't get enough. They might actually get too much because there's these big, huge holes in the nipples, and they get too much in and end up with ear infections or pneumonia because fluid gets into their lungs, and then they're sick and they don't get nourished. And other feeding practices, we often see kids fed from behind. The caregiver stands behind them or sits behind them and feeds them and isn't really paying attention to what's going in their mouth. They might be fed too rapidly, or you'll often see several kids sitting on the floor and one caregiver with one bowl and giving each one a turn, feeding them. And so obviously they're not able to track how much one individual child ate when they're fed like that. Another biggie is lack of time outside, which means lack of exposure to the sun, which can lead to vitamin D deficiency, and which is rickets. And you know, another biggie is just stress, and that gets back to your previous question. You know, when a child is transitioned from their birth mother to a secondary care provider, maybe a third and a fourth if they're in an institution and they move from room to room, or they go into foster care and back, and then they go into their adoptive family. All that stress can just interrupt the natural feeding cycle and lead to malnutrition. And then, you know, just what you said before, not receiving enough attention and love and nurturing means they don't grow. I think it's been shown that if a child receives the same diet over time, but if they're on the same diet, their diet never changes, but they start getting more individualized attention and love and care, they start to grow, which is really depressing, quite frankly, that that's what it takes to grow, is attention and love, which is something, of course, every child should have.
Absolutely. So what are the most common nutritional deficits for the internationally adopted child?
Yeah, we're beginning to find that there are common nutritional deficiencies across the countries. I mean, it doesn't really matter what country a child is from. They're all at risk for some. Some they will be at higher risks. For example, countries further away from the equator are going to be at higher risk for vitamin D deficiency just because there's less exposure to sunlight. It appears that, for example, children from Russia have a higher rate of vitamin D deficiency than children from China, which is closer to the equator. But no matter what country a child is from, they do have a risk for vitamin D deficiency. And then the other big one, the very big one, is iron deficiency. A very high percentage of children living in institutions are iron deficient or anemic. And that's important because when babies and young children don't get enough iron for when their bodies are developing, it actually impacts them their whole life. Even if you take care of it by, say, age 2, that iron deficiency in the first 2 years will have impacts into adulthood. Another one, which is just kind of becoming apparent, is zinc deficiency. So that's an important one to watch out for. And then
what does that do? What is zinc deficiency?
One of the symptoms of zinc deficiency is diarrhea. So, often kids will be adopted and have diarrhea, and it's thought to be the change in diet, which it very well could be, or parasites, which it very well could be. So those things do need to be ruled out. But sometimes if they have chronic ongoing diarrhea, it could be a zinc deficiency, which might need supplementation, or it might just correct itself with an improved diet. And, a pediatrician can let a parent know whether they need to supplement or not. It's not something you can diagnose or kind of treat on your own. You need help with that. And, all the micronutrient and macronutrient deficiencies impact growth and development overall. One that's really common and often also overlooked is stunting, which means a child is too short for their body frame. And, there's a lot of reasons it's overlooked. A lot of times you'll often hear people say, my child is short because, that's her genetic predisposition. And while that may be the case, it may be that they're stunted because they haven't reached their full height potential. They didn't get enough nutrition and haven't reached their full height potential. And it can be tricky to catch because those kids sometimes appear sort of stocky and solid because they've developed sort of width-wise the way they're supposed to, but they haven't reached their height. So they sort of look short and stocky. And so people will say, oh, my kid's chubby. They were so well-nourished in the orphanage that they're now chubby. But really, they're stunted, which means they were malnourished and didn't get enough nutrition. So it's this often, we hear it often, this mistaken perception that a child is well-nourished because they're sort of stocky and chubby, and they very well may be undernourished. And stunting is a very big indicator of poor nutrition.
Okay, so what about the quality of formula or meals in different areas of the world?
Well, we've found that the quality is most often, if not always, poor. It varies from orphanage to orphanage and from country to country, but in general, the diets we find are low in iron, low in micronutrients that one would get from fresh produce, just low in variety. Oftentimes the kids are getting sort of the same meals every day or every week. The formula, as I mentioned before, is often not iron fortified, and the kids don't get it as long as they should. Sometimes it's sort of a cheap local formula, and who knows what micronutrients are in it. And the low in iron that I mentioned is usually the kids aren't getting enough meat. And, as we know in a Western diet, you don't have to have meat to be healthy, but if you're not eating meat, there are ways to make sure you are healthy. And in these cases, kids are usually not eating meat because it's not available, and there aren't other things being done to the diet to ensure they get enough iron. So that's why so many of the kids are iron deficient.
What questions should adoptive parents ask of orphanage staff or caregivers?
Well, if they're lucky enough to be able to ask the questions, ideally they should be asked before the family even travels. That way the family can be prepared by bringing some of the favorite foods and items. But even if they can ask them in country, that's great. And then they could go out and shop there for what's needed. So I think it's very important to find out what a child is currently eating and drinking and trying to stick to that routine until the family's home, and then making a slow transition once home. Parents are always anxious to get kids on healthier diets and feed them what they perceive to be healthy foods, but sometimes that's too much of a shock to a child's system. So we recommend that a family find out what the child's eating and drinking and try to stick with that, especially if it's formula. Stick with the formula they're on. Try to buy enough in country to last you till you get home, and then make that gradual transition when you're at home, when you have access to your pediatrician. In case there are issues, then your pediatrician's right there and you're not dealing with the issues in another country without any medical support. So some specific questions. We have a list on our website, and it has just some basic things that you might not think of in the moment, like does the child feed him or herself, and how do they handle utensils? What kind of cup or bottle do they use? Can they feed themselves the cup or bottle? What consistency of food is being served? Oftentimes in orphanages, kids are kept on real mushy food because it's just easier to kind of shovel in. And a child who is, say, 18 months, who in the U.S. would be finger feeding themselves, might have never had that experience. So you can't just assume, the What to Expect book says feed this type of consistency because they're this old. You sort of have to start with them where they are. And if they're 9 months old and not sitting up yet because they haven't moved a lot, they may not even be ready for spoon feeding. So you need to kind of see where they are and work from that. And then finding out a meal schedule and trying to stick to that meal schedule. Is it every 2 or 3 hours? What time do they get up? Oftentimes in orphanages, kids have their first meal really early. And then just finding out specific foods that the child likes and dislikes, and maybe even brands. And, if there's a specific food they like, what brand is it? And is it something you can find in country to buy some extras to bring home?
In the post-placement phase, we sometimes see that children who have lived in orphanages gradually learn to be more selective about their foods. Would you say that is due to the lack of variety offered in the orphanage or the feeding techniques?
That's right. Oftentimes kids don't develop that pickiness until they get home and realize they have choices, and that should be seen as positive. I think, a lot of parents get worried that all of a sudden they're becoming picky eaters, but it's really a positive step in their development that they're showing choices, preferences. And, another thing that kids don't often get a chance to do, we're always amazed. Our team has been in many, many different orphanages, and it's very rare that you see a child feeding themselves with their fingers. They'll go right from being fed with a spoon to feeding themselves with a spoon when they're quite a bit older, but they don't get that chance to play with food and touch it, and so that's possibly a stage that's been missed. That's probably a good idea to go back and let a child do, even if they're a little bit older.
Okay, and what feeding issues occur when a child transitions from an orphanage to a family?
That's getting right from that point of not touching food. That's one of the reasons a couple of these can occur. The two main issues that are usually seen are either selective eating or hoarding, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can see both in the same child. You can see them at the same time. You can see them come and go. So hoarding is, I think a lot of people are more familiar with hoarding and expect that, but it actually seems like selective eating is what we're seeing more of. But hoarding can include anything from stashing food away, like hiding it under their pillow or in their room somewhere, in their pockets. But it also can be things like eating excessive amounts, storing food in their mouths for later. I was actually talking to a parent yesterday who explained that she'll find food in her daughter's cheek like 3 hours later, something from a meal. And it's not that the child can't chew and swallow it, she's just saving it. And just hoarding can also be just a child who wants to eat all the time and is really, really stressed about it and is always in the kitchen kind of bugging you and asking you when the next meal is. And then you kind of have the opposite extreme, although again, they co-occur, and that's selective eating. And that's a child who accepts a very limited diet and might have difficulties with whole categories of food. So we're not talking like your typical toddler picky eater. This is maybe a child who won't eat any meat, won't eat cooked vegetables, won't eat anything with cheese in it, maybe only has like 10 or 12 foods that they'll routinely eat, and might even be restricted to certain brands. Like they'll eat this brand of strawberry yogurt, but not this brand of strawberry yogurt. They might eat one thing one day and you kind of get excited, but then they don't eat it ever again. They might even develop rituals around food, like only eating out of a certain container or only drinking juice out of a juice box. In fact, we have a family story on our website. Our website has several family stories, and there's the one that's up currently is of a little boy who would only eat food out of bags and not on a plate. And his new mother couldn't figure that out for quite a while, and he wouldn't eat anything, and she was super stressed. And one day she handed him a bag of food, of something from Starbucks, and he gobbled it up. And then she figured out, oh, he thinks food needs to come in a bag. That was just his prior experience. And so you can get real picky eating, and both of those issues, hoarding or picky eating, may take a long time to resolve, and that's I think that's an important message to get across. It's probably not something you're going to fix in a week or two or a month or two, and that's okay. It might be a gradual process. And I think if parents know that in the beginning, then they won't get so stressed, because it can be very stressful to go through as a parent. But I think if you just kind of remove yourself a little bit and follow your child's lead, and don't get stressed and worked up about it, you'll be much more successful in helping them get through it.
I like hearing you say that the child should be allowed to take their lead on their food preferences. But can you discuss this a little further, as well as more information about food hoarding? Because I know that can be really tough for families in the post-placement phase.
Yeah, I wouldn't get into power struggles. I would let them lead, and there are certain things you can do to kind of set your child up for success if they do hoard. And this also goes for the selective eating too. I think for hoarding, you've got a child with a high stress level, and who wants to eat all the time, and that stresses parents out, especially in our culture where we're always worried about kids being overweight, and that's the message we hear all the time. And yet here's a child who eats, you will see kids who can literally eat 3 or 4 times more than their parents do in a day. That's stressful for a parent to watch. But some things that can be done, following the child's lead, is very important. Also, just setting up a very consistent schedule for snacks and meals. When first home especially, food should be offered at the table maybe every 2 hours, which seems a little bit excessive, but you want the child to learn that food is always available. And then when they've been around a little longer and they're starting to get a little more relaxed, you can stretch that out to every 2 or 3 hours. And then the child needs to see that the food comes from the parent. They need to have... It makes them feel more secure to know that they're not in charge of it, and the parent is going to bring them food. But the parent needs to also give some control to the child. So the parent can bring the food to the table, but then maybe let the child, depending on their age and ability level, let the child decide how much goes on their plate, and they get to decide if they're going to eat it. Some children who hoard are also picky eaters, so they may eat a lot, but they may eat a lot of only 2 or 3 things. And so it's okay to let the child decide, I'm not going to eat this today, but I'm going to eat this, and not to get into those power struggles and to do those things that we maybe were raised with, such as you got to have 2 bites of this before you get up from the table, or you've got to eat your dinner before you have your dessert, or clean your plate. You got to sort of let all that go and let the child lead. The only time the parent should really intervene is if the child is eating to the point of throwing up. And that happens. And at that point, the parent needs to obviously cut the child off. But if that's not happening, I wouldn't even cut the child off. Let them eat until they decide they're full. And it's scary. And the first week or 2 of a child doing that can be really scary because you think it's going to last forever. But if you let the child do that, they're going to slow down over time. They're going to realize there's food there and they're allowed to eat it, and they won't keep eating that way. Research actually shows that the more a child's food intake is restricted, the more they will eat. The less it's restricted, the less they will eat. So keep that in mind as you're like biting your tongue, wanting to say, stop, that's enough. If you do that, you set up that stress reaction in them that, oh no, there's not enough food again, or I don't have enough food, and then they want to eat more and they can't let it go. Whereas if you let them figure that out for themselves, they'll eat less. You want to get them to the point where they trust that there will always be food. And you can also the parent should develop a few reassuring phrases that they constantly say to remind the child. Things like, there's always enough food here, or you can always ask for food, or we always have enough food for you. And just say those over and over again until the child internalizes that.
What do you think adopting parents need to know about micronutrients and macronutrients?
Micronutrients are just the nutrients that we need in our bodies in small amounts. So basically vitamins and minerals. The macronutrients are the ones we need in large amounts, like fat and calories, protein. The micronutrients are things like iron and vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin C, zinc, those things. And typically if a child is on a balanced diet, they'll get all their micronutrients. for a middle class or upper middle class family in the United States, there's not a huge worry about micronutrient deficiencies, unless they're vegan or vegetarian, and then they need to make extra efforts to get iron and vitamin B and stuff. But for a general family, that's not an issue. However, even if you eat a balanced diet and your child comes from a background where they had undernourishment or malnourishment, they're at risk of not absorbing they're at risk because they maybe don't have the stores needed. And so they don't have good iron stores, for example, when they come to the new home. And then even though they're eating a very balanced diet, they can still become anemic. So a family needs to be aware that, first of all, to offer a balanced diet, but secondly, that may not be enough. And even if you offer a balanced diet, if your child had a rough start, they may need multivitamins. They may need specific supplements like vitamin D, possibly zinc, very likely iron, and those are things that the pediatrician can help you determine. Again, you're not going to know without a blood test. And I also would encourage parents not to think, okay, well, my child's iron is low, but we eat a really balanced diet, so they'll be okay. That may not be the case. They very well may need supplements to get them back up to that sort of safe zone.
Okay. And what are post-adoption growth spurts?
Yeah, and that leads right into that. So what often happens, almost always, is when a child is adopted, they have this booming growth spurt where they just grow rapidly for the first 6 to 12 months home. Part of that is merely because, like we talked before, about the attention. They're now getting attention, nourishment, love, and that alone makes them grow. They're also very likely getting the calories they need and maybe extras. And that's one of the reasons not to restrict your child's intake. Their body really may need it. It may look like they're just eating like nuts, but they're also growing a lot and they might really need it. And they might even get a little chubby at first, but then they get a lot of linear growth and use that. So what happens, why this is important to know is one, so you don't restrict your child's eating, but also when the child grows a lot, they call on their body's stores, their nutritional stores, for that growth. And if a child has, again, I'll use the example of iron because it's the most prevalent. If a child has low iron stores, say they're not anemic, they're tested and they're not really anemic, they're fine, but their stores are low, that's their ferritin, that's low. They grow really rapidly and they call on all those stores and then all of a sudden they are anemic. So while in the orphanage they may not have been anemic, they might have been fine, but then when they came home and grew rapidly, suddenly they became anemic. And this is sort of new information for everybody. Oftentimes kids are given a blood test when they first get home. They're not anemic, and then it's never tested again. Well, in the meantime, they've been anemic for a long time because nobody thought to check after their growth spurt. So it's really important that to check the child when they're first home for iron, vitamin D. We have a list of what to test for on our website. Test for all of that, but then retest in 6 months and continue to retest every 6 months until the child's levels are normal. If after the first 6 months there are no concerns, then you probably don't need to keep retesting. But after the first 6 months, if they come up iron deficient, which happens on a regular basis, then test again after 6 more months until they're no longer iron deficient.
Children with special needs often have extra special nutrition needs. What do families expecting to adopt a child with special needs need to know about feeding?
That's a tricky one because it really depends on the child's special needs, but I think the most important thing for a family to know is that if they're adopting a child with special needs, that child will most likely have unique nutrition and feeding needs that will need to be met. First of all, as many people probably know, there are more and more children with special needs being adopted. And some of the common special needs, like, for example, a child with cleft lip and palate may have special feeding needs, depending kind of where they are in the process of having their lip and palate repaired. So, for example, if a child has a cleft lip and palate, depending on what stage of their lip and palate repair, they're adopted, they may have special needs. If everything's repaired, they might eat and drink normally, and it's not an issue. But if they're in the middle of repair, for example, a common scenario is their lip has been repaired, but their palate has not been repaired yet. And so they may have trouble sucking from a bottle because they can't get the suction needed. And so a parent needs to be prepared to maybe try some adaptive nipples, or to find out, is there one caregiver who really knows how to feed their child, and what tricks do they use, and try to learn those tricks. They also maybe need to be prepared to offer their child a higher, kind of a nutrient-dense, higher calorie diet. And their pediatrician can help with that. But very often kids with special needs, again, for example, cleft lip and palate, are very underweight because they've missed out on a lot of nutrition. Another example would be children with cerebral palsy. They're often underweight, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is they burn a lot of calories because of their movement patterns. And then the other is sometimes it's harder to feed them, so they don't get enough calories in. And so they also need to be fed with a higher kind of nutrient-dense, higher calorie diet. And that's something a lot of families can prepare at home. It doesn't mean special expensive formula. It just means tricks for how you prepare the food. And then, so depending what the special need is, there are things to learn along those lines. But kind of another overriding message would be to meet the child where they are with their feeding. So, for example, again, the general rule is start spoon feeding a child and adding complementary foods when they're 6 months old. So again, that's something you might read in a book. Well, you might adopt a 16-month-old who's not sitting up yet on their own. And they very well may sit up soon once they get activity and attention and movement. But right now, at 16 months, they're not sitting up. They may actually not even be ready for spoon feeding yet. So you may need to not go by the books, but kind of go with where they're at. And then when they're sitting up well on their own, you can introduce spoon feeding. Or maybe you need to figure out a way to help them sit up on their own so you can introduce it. The same is true with foods with textures. If your child has special needs, they may not be able to handle chewing, and they may not have had experience chewing. So just because they're 3, you might not hand them, see what they were eating before, and again, meet them where they are, and then gradually step up to giving them more and more complex foods.
Utensils and bottles commonly used in orphanages are quite different than those that will be used in adoptive families. What issues may be experienced with this utensil transition?
We sometimes laugh at Spoon Foundation just because every orphanage we go to, the kids are being fed with spoons like this big. We have yet to see an orphanage that uses not even baby child spoons, but just regular size spoons. They're always these huge, huge spoons. And so, seriously, the kids may have no experience eating with a regular spoon, and they might get grumpy if you feed them at a regular pace with a regular size spoon. They want it all now, hurry up, they're used to that. That's very common. And so there may be a little transition period to getting them to accept what we would consider regular amounts of food. And then, we see all kinds of things with bottles. A very common one also is that the nipples in the bottles are made really large, and that's so the kids don't have to suck very much, and the food just sort of flows in and it goes really, really fast. And so what you end up getting is mouths that aren't really fully developed. You get sort of these low-tone mouths. You'll often see kids with kind of posture with their tongue out and their cheeks sort of hanging there. And that's just because they don't have all the experience sucking and chewing and moving food around in their mouths. And they'll gain that, but you should be prepared that the child may be a very messy eater at first. And that's because they haven't had a lot of experience doing whatever they're now getting the experience to do that they need to do. And that they're probably doing their best, but they may be very messy and they just need time to experience that. Or even learning, some really young children, babies who are adopted, don't even know how to suck out of a bottle, and they may need to learn that.
Yeah.
So again, don't be too worried. If your child can't eat very well right in the beginning, I wouldn't freak out. I would just know that they may not have had the proper experience to even have that opportunity yet.
Yes, that's interesting that you mentioned some kids want it all right now. I regularly hear in the post-placement phase that with toddler-aged children from orphanages, they'll often scream at mealtime. What do you think parents should know about that?
Well, maybe just knowing that the reason they're doing it is because that's what they were used to before, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything's wrong. And just being patient, maybe having meal times in a kind of a quiet, low stimulating environment, dim lights, turn the TV off, and teach them new habits, that meal time's a pleasant place where everybody sits at the table together, which is very important also, family style meals, calm environment, not getting into power struggles. Some of those phrases we mentioned before might be helpful there. Oh, we've got enough food. There's enough time. Kind of some of those. And actually, if you see that when you're in country, it might be good to learn that in the child's native language. A little phrase like that that's reassuring to them, and find out what that is.
Okay, great. And Mishelle, where can families go for more information?
Got a few websites. One is ours, which is adoptionnutrition.org. I referenced that before. We've got family stories on there, mainly so families know that they're not alone, and so they can see success stories and see what one family did for such and such an issue and what one family did for another issue. We also have the list of lab tests on there. It's a PDF you can print off. It's the list you take to your doctor for that first initial visits, and it's the nutrition lab tests. It doesn't cover the other ones. We also have handouts on there specific to special needs. We have a section for special needs, and there are some handouts on there that cover like how to make a diet high calorie, or some like the surgery schedule for cleft lip and palate and how to feed around that. It's loaded with information very specific to the nutrition and feeding of adopted kids. Another website that I really like is thefeedingdoctor.com, and that is Dr. Katja Roel's website, and she has on there a book that's specifically for nutrition, specifically for feeding of adopted children. She doesn't cover nutrition as much, but the feeding and the questions you asked about, sort of when the kids are screaming, what do you do? And if the kid's hoarding food, what do you do? Another good one is adoptmed.org, and that's out of the University of Washington. That's Julian Davies and Julia Bledsoe's website, and there are a lot of, it covers a lot of topics like sleep and behavior and stuff, but there is also a section on feeding and nutrition there too that's really helpful.
Mishelle, thank you so much for this information. I do think that it will be incredibly helpful for children and their adoptive families.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you reaching out to us. We're always working on ways to kind of get the word out about our resources. So if you ever need anything else, please let us know.
I sure will. And thank you again, Spoon Foundation. Thank you for sharing your awesome resource of Mishelle Rudzinski for this International Adoption Nutrition interview. And that will conclude the session.